The buyer's bank draft lay on the table for £30,000. Diana Egerton, 21, mended her own petticoat in the upper room while her uncle counted the notes downstairs. Lord Reginald Egerton, baron of a bankrupt house in Lancashire, had sold her in marriage to Lord Henry Mordaunt, owner of 3 coal mines and a temper sharper than his cravat. The chapel was prepared for dawn. The white silk gown hung on the door like a verdict. By morning she did not weep. She dropped the bouquet at the chapel threshold, took a maid's coarse grey cloak from a hook, and ran. The first carriage she found stood with its door ajar. She climbed in breathless, the white silk muddied at the hem, the auburn coils of her hair half loosened beneath the borrowed wool. Only when the door snapped shut did her eyes adjust to the gloom. On the opposite bench sat a man she had never met. Tall, narrow, with cold, pale eyes the color of wet flint, an ivory cane resting against his knee, and a silver fox-head signet on his right hand. Cassius Borchier, Duke of Pelham. He struck the carriage roof once with the cane, ordered the coachman to drive at speed, and murmured, almost to himself, that a small bird had flown out of one cage and into another made of gold. What he wanted from a runaway bride no one had warned her about. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. In the autumn of 1815, the eastern wing of Egerton Hall in Lancashire had begun, very politely, to die. The bricks held. The chimneys still smoked, but the wallpaper in the long gallery had bloomed into damp constellations no housekeeper bothered to scrub, and the portraits of dead Egertons had been turned to face the wall in 3 rooms, one by one, as their gilt frames were sold off to a dealer in Manchester, who paid in coin and asked no questions. In the linen room above the kitchens, a single tallow candle guttered on a deal table. Diana Egerton bent over a torn petticoat with a needle between her teeth and a flat, methodical patience in her hands. The fire was nearly out. She had let it burn down on purpose. Coal cost 2 shillings a scuttle, and on the eve of her own wedding she did not see why the house should spend 2 shillings on her warmth. She drew the linen taut over her knee and began the rip in the hem. 3 stitches, 4. The petticoat was old, her mother's, and the stitches her mother had set long ago were finer than her own. She could feel the difference under her fingertip. She did not lift her eyes when the heavy step came along the corridor outside, though she knew it by the unevenness of the gait. The right boot dragged slightly. The left came down hard. Lord Egerton walked like a man whose blood ran half claret and half debt. The door opened without a knock. It always did. "There you are," her uncle said, and laughed, as though she might be elsewhere. "Mending, on the night before." "The hem tore on the staircase," Diana said evenly. "I should not like to walk to my own wedding in rags." "You shall not walk anywhere in rags after tomorrow." He filled the doorway with his belly first and his face after, the Porto flush already crawling up his cheeks to the gray of his whiskers. He carried a strongbox under his arm. He carried it the way one carries an infant, with both arms, very close. "After tomorrow, my dear, you shall walk only in silk." He set the strongbox on the table beside her candle. The brass corners knocked the wood. He took the key from the chain at his waistcoat and opened the lid in front of her without ceremony. Banknotes, folded into thick, neat sheaves, tied with red tape that still smelled of the lawyer's office in Preston. Above them, gold sovereigns in canvas bags, whose mouths were stitched in cross thread. He plunged his hand into one of the bags and brought up a fistful and let the coins fall back through his fingers so she would hear them. She heard them. She did not look up from her stitch. 30,000, he said. Pounds. Sterling. Paid this evening into my hand. The remainder in funds on the morrow at the consummation of the deed. He waited. He liked an audience. Lord Mordaunt is generous. Lord Mordaunt is buying, Diana said. The smile slipped a half-inch on her uncle's face and settled again. You will not say such things in his house, girl. I am not in his house. I am in yours. She drew the needle through. For one more night. He sat down opposite her with a grunt and a rustle of stained mustard waistcoat. The Egerton signet on his forefinger caught the candle. A worn intaglio of the family crest, a heart's head crowned, that her grandfather had once worn proudly enough to be painted with. Now it rode the knuckle of a man who had pawned the silver to pay a faro debt at Brooks's. 30,000 pounds, he said again. He could not stop saying the figure. He laid it on the air between them, as though it were a thing she might admire if she only looked at it from the proper angle. Do you know, Diana, what £30,000 does for a man with my obligations? It pays Mr. Blackshaw, and Mr. Yarwood, and the wine merchant in Lancaster, and the 7 creditors who held your note at the September meeting and were promised satisfaction by Michaelmas. She did not raise her voice. She knew the names because she had spent 2 years opening the letters he refused to open. It does not pay all of them, but it pays the loudest of them. It pays the gentlemen, he said sharply. The tradesmen will wait. They have waited 4 years already. He brought his fist down on the table. The candle jumped, the needle slipped, and a small bright pearl of blood rose on the pad of her left thumb. She watched the bead with great interest, as though it belonged to another woman. Then she put her thumb to her mouth and sucked it. The taste of iron steadied her. You speak, he said, as though you had been wronged, as though I had not housed you these 11 years, as though I had not buried your father at my own expense. You buried him in the parish ground, the stone was given by the rector, and clothed you, and fed you, and put a French master in this house. You dismissed the French master in the 2nd quarter for non-payment. I taught myself from his books, and arranged, at considerable trouble to myself, a match such as no woman of your circumstances in this kingdom had any right to expect. He leaned across the table. His breath came warm and sweet with port. Lord Henry Mordaunt is master of 3 collieries. 3. The smallest of them clears 9,000 a year. He has a house in Mayfair with 22 rooms and a hothouse the length of a frigate. He is 41 years of age and unmarried. He chose you, Diana. He saw you at the Preston Assembly, and he chose you out of a room of better dowered, better mannered, better tempered women, and the price he chose to pay for you is sitting here on this table, and you mend a petticoat and look at me as though I had sold you to the devil. You have not sold me to the devil, uncle, Diana said. The devil would have paid you more. There was a silence in the linen room. Outside, somewhere far down the corridor, a maid dropped a copper pan and swore, and the swear was hushed by another voice. And then the silence came back, larger than before. Lord Egerton sat back slowly. He closed the lid of the strong box. He turned the key in the lock. The click was small and final. You will marry him at 10 o'clock tomorrow, he said, in the chapel here. The bishop has come from Lancaster. The carriage is ordered from the inn. Mrs. Paget has dressed the chapel in white roses at a cost of 3 guineas, which Lord Mordaunt has graciously consented to add to my account. You will wear your mother's pearls, which I have, at great inconvenience, redeemed from the pawnshop for the morning, and you will step into Lord Mordaunt's carriage at 11:30, and you will go with him to Mordaunt Park, and you will give him what he has paid me for. Do you understand me? She did not answer. Do you understand me, Diana? She drew the needle through the linen. 5 stitches, 6. I understand you, uncle, as I have always understood you, she said. Perfectly. He waited. He waited a long moment for some further softening of her voice, some sign of the weeping he had been promised by the housekeeper and the women of his acquaintance, who had assured him that all young brides wept the night before, and that the weeping was an excellent thing because it left them tractable in the morning. Diana did not weep. She tied off her thread and bit it clean. He rose. He took the strong box under his arm again. At the door he turned. You are like your mother, he said. She also had a way of looking at one. It was unbecoming in her. It is unbecoming in you. Lord Mordaunt will correct it. My mother died of a fever, Diana said, in this house, in a bed without coal, while you were in London. I would not invoke her tonight. His face went the color of his waistcoat. He opened his mouth, and then he shut it, and then he carried his strong-box out of the linen room and closed the door behind him with a care that was worse than slamming. She listened to him go. The uneven step, down the gallery, down the stairs, into the small study where he would pour himself another glass of port and count the notes again with the door locked. She knew his evening as well as she knew her own pulse. She set down the petticoat. Then, and only then, did she allow her hands to shake. She held them out in front of her in the candlelight and watched them tremble. Not with fear, she thought, but with something colder and more useful, an animal alertness that had been gathering in her marrow for a week, and which she had not, until this moment, permitted herself to name. She turned her left hand over. The pearl of blood on her thumb had dried into a small dark dot. On her smallest finger, the Egerton signet she had been given on her 16th birthday, Her father's, not her uncle's, the older and finer of the two, caught the candle and gave back a dull red gold. She rose from the stool, she crossed the linen room and crouched and lifted the loose floorboard beneath the window, the one she had pried up 4 nights ago and replaced with such care that even Mrs. Paget, who knew every joint of the house, had walked over it 3 times without pausing. Inside the cavity lay a small leather purse, 11 shillings and 6pence, scraped from the housekeeping over 6 months. A folded square of paper on which she had written, in her own clear copperplate, the names and directions of the 3 respectable women in the north of England who had known her mother. A length of plain dark wool, a maid's cloak, taken from the peg by the scullery door and replaced each morning before light, until tomorrow, when it would not be replaced, and, wrapped in a kerchief, a small pair of scissors, and a tinderbox. She closed the floorboard. She returned to the table. She put the petticoat away. Then she went to the press in the corner and took out the wedding gown. It hung pale in the candlelight, white silk in the Regency cut Lord Mordaunt himself had specified by letter to her uncle, high waist beneath the bust, short puffed sleeves, modest rounded neck, straight skirt to the ankle, satin slippers laid in tissue beneath. The flowers for her hair, white roses, 3 guineas of them, sat in a shallow bowl on the chest, half blown, waiting to be pinned into the half coil that Mrs. Paget would dress at 6 in the morning. The dress was beautiful. It was also a receipt. Every inch of it was a line in the ledger between her uncle and Lord Mordaunt, and she could read the figures in the stitching. She lifted the gown and laid it carefully on the bed. She straightened the sleeves. She smoothed the bodice. She arranged the skirt as though for a sleeping woman. She did this slowly. She did this with respect. Whatever the gown was, it had done her no harm. The silkworm and the seamstress had done her no harm. Only the men had done her harm. She would not punish a dress for the sins of barons. Then she said aloud, to the empty room, and to the white silk, and to her mother, who had died in a bed without coal, I will not wake tomorrow as Mrs. Mordaunt. She said it once. She did not say it twice. Once was a vow, twice would have been a prayer, and she had outgrown prayer at 14, the night the rector took the headstone money for the parish poor fund and did not return it. She undressed. She put on her plain stuff gown over her shift and laced it herself. She wound her auburn-brown hair into a low coil at her nape and pinned it with 2 pins, no more. She did not look at her face in the small glass above the washstand. She did not need to see her face. She knew what it would tell her, and it would not be useful between now and morning. She blew out the candle. In the dark of the linen room, she sat upright on the stool with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the house die slowly around her. The clock in the gallery struck 11, and then the half hour, and then 12. Lord Egerton's step did not come back. A door closed somewhere below. A key turned in the lock of the study. The dog in the yard barked once at a fox and then was quiet. The wind found a loose pane in the corridor window and worried at it with the patience of a thief. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, of the carriage. Not Lord Mordaunt's carriage, which would come for her at 11:30 in the morning, lacquered black with a yellow line and a Mordaunt arms on the door and 4 bays in matched harness. The other carriage, the hired one, the one ordered from the inn at Garstang for the bishop and his clerk, to bring them from the village to the chapel at 9. The one that, in the confusion between the bishop's arrival and the bride's procession, would stand for perhaps a quarter of an hour at the south gate of the park, unattended but for a single drowsy postboy, while its passengers were taken into the house for chocolate. She had walked the south gate every morning for a week. She had timed the postboy. She had counted his yawns. She did not think beyond the south gate. She had learned, in the long apprenticeship of being the unpaid ward of a bankrupt house, that a plan made too far ahead was a plan that announced itself in one's eyes at supper. She would think to the south gate. At the south gate, she would think to the next thing. That was enough. The clock struck 1. In the cold, dark Diana Egerton sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her father's signet glinting faintly on her smallest finger, and she practiced, as she had been practicing every night that week, the small thing she would have to do at dawn. She would lift the white silk gown and put it on, as Mrs. Paget expected, and she would let her hair be dressed with the white roses, and she would walk down the staircase on her uncle's arm, and she would smile at the bishop, and she would smile at Lord Mordaunt where he stood at the altar, in his blue military coat, with the gold-embroidered waistcoat, and the broken eyebrow, and the sapphire ring on his smallest finger, and she would take the bouquet from Mrs. Paget's hand at the chapel door, and she would turn, in that hinge of a moment between the porch and the aisle, and she would walk, instead of in, out, through the side door, across the yew walk, to the south gate, to the hired carriage, to whatever the next thing would be. She would not be Mrs. Mordaunt. She would not be anything anyone had paid for. Far away in the great study below, behind a locked door, Lord Egerton uncorked a second bottle of port and counted his banknotes by the light of a branch of wax candles he had not paid the chandler for. He counted them twice. He arranged them in piles by denomination. He thought, briefly and without affection, of his niece, and decided that her silence at supper had been the silence of resignation, which was the proper silence of a bride. And he poured himself another glass and drank to Lord Mordaunt, and to the colliery in Wigan, and to the gentleman from Lincoln's Inn who would call upon him on Friday to discuss the discharge of certain bonds, and to his own continued residence in the only house that bore his name. Upstairs in the linen room, his niece sat in the dark and waited for morning, and was not resigned to anything at all. Outside, beyond the park wall, on the Preston Road, a black traveling carriage with no arms on its doors and 4 matched greys in the traces drew up at the milestone, and the gentleman inside drew back the curtain a half-inch with the silver fox head of his cane and looked, without expression, across the dark fields toward the lit window of Egerton Hall. He let the curtain fall. He tapped the roof of the carriage twice with the cane. The horses walked on. For a long moment Diana did not look at him. She looked at the floor of the carriage, at the dark grain of the polished wood, at the toe of one satin slipper showing beneath the gray wool cape. The mud on the slipper had begun to dry into a pale crust. The carriage moved with a smoothness she had never known in any Egerton vehicle. There was no rattle, no slide, only the steady rocking of expensive springs. She felt the gaze of the man across from her settle on her hair, on the half-undone bridal coil, on the white flowers still clinging there as though they had not yet been told that the bride had run. "You may remove the cape, Miss Egerton," he said. His voice was low and dry, as if he had spoken little that morning and was conserving what remained. "Or keep it. I have no preference. But the heat in here will become unkind in a quarter of an hour." She did not remove the cape. She pulled it tighter at the throat. Her fingers found the rough seam where some kitchen girl had stitched it years ago and held there. "You know my name." "I know a great many things." He shifted the ivory cane between his knees, his gloved hands resting one over the other on the silver fox head. "I know that the bell of the Egerton Chapel rang 4 times this morning and not 5. I know that your uncle paid the bell ringer in advance to ring 5. I know that the gentleman waiting at the altar has a temper such that the candles will already have been put out and the cake taken back to the kitchen. Who are you?" "A friend, for the present hour." He did not smile. "Cassius Borchier." The name meant nothing to her. She had not been brought out. She had been kept in Lancashire. The London papers reached the house 6 days late, and her uncle burned the society pages first, because his name appeared in them less and less, and at last not at all. "You are a gentleman." "I am a duke." He said it as another man might say the weather. "Pelham." She let her eyes lift to his face for the first time. He was lean, the bones close beneath the skin, the jaw newly shaven, and faintly pink along the line of the razor. His eyes, in the dim, shifting light of the carriage interior, were the color of weak tea poured over silver. There was a thin, pale scar on the left side of the upper lip, very old, the kind a child gets falling from a pony onto a stone path. A single fine line of premature gray ran above the right temple into the dark hair combed back from the brow. He did not look at her as a man looks at a woman whose price he is calculating. He looked at her as a man looks at a chessboard already begun by someone else, in which he has just been invited to move. "Where are we going?" "Out of Lancashire." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I am prepared to give while your uncle's grooms are still able to mount horses." He turned his head a fraction towards the small window, where the leather curtain had been drawn down and pegged. "By tomorrow morning, the answer will be more particular." The carriage took a long bend at speed. Diana was thrown lightly against the padded wall. She did not put out a hand to steady herself. She let her body take the motion as it came, the way a person who has spent the night running takes any further blow. Her stomach turned. She had eaten nothing since the watered porridge of the previous afternoon. He watched her color change. "Mrs. Pickering," he said, raising his voice only slightly. There was a small wooden hatch at his shoulder. He did not open it. A woman's answer came through the panel from the box behind. "Your Grace." At the next milestone, bread and the small wine. "Your Grace." He returned his attention to Diana with no shift of expression. "You will eat in 12 minutes. Before then you will keep your head against the cushion, here." He indicated the corner. "Travel sickness is a poor companion. Vexation is a worse one. We shall dispatch the first. The second we may speak of, if you wish." She did not move to the corner. Pride held her upright. But she felt the bones of her neck loosen by a fraction without her permission. "You bought me," she said. "I did not. My uncle has been paid £30,000 for me. The papers were sealed last night. I saw the wax. If you are now telling the coachman to drive harder, it is because you have made a different bargain than Mordaunt did. I should like to know its terms before I owe you anything." A small sound came from him. It was not a laugh. It was perhaps the ghost of one, dry as the turn of a page. "You believe I have purchased you. I believe men do not place carriages outside chapels at 9:30 in the morning to assist strangers. You are correct in the general principle." He tilted the cane. "You are wrong in the particular case. I have not paid your uncle a farthing. Your uncle will, by Michaelmas, be paying me, among others." She did not understand. She did not let her face show that she did not understand. "Then what am I to you?" He considered her. The carriage rolled on. The bend straightened. The horses found their long stride, and the world outside the leather curtain became a steady rushing sound, the sound of a river one cannot see. "You are," he said at last, "a small bird that has flown out of a cage of iron and into a cage of gold. Whether you remain in this one is a matter we shall determine together, in due course. For the present hour, the gold cage has the merit of not being the iron one. I would advise you to use the hour to breathe." Diana looked at him. Her throat was tight. She would not weep. She had not wept in the chapel, and she would not weep now, in a stranger's carriage, while he spoke of cages in that careful, unhurried voice that gave away nothing. "I am not a bird," she said. "No. And I am not a transaction." "No? Then say what I am." He was silent. The ivory of the cane glimmered between his hands. Outside, the morning had grown brighter. A thin line of sun lay along the bottom of the drawn curtain. "You are," he said, "a woman whose uncle wrote a letter on the 14th of last month to a banker in Manchester, in which he undertook to deliver his niece into the bed of Lord Henry Mordaunt by Michaelmas, in exchange for a discharge of certain notes of hand. That letter, Miss Egerton, is presently in a leather case in Lincoln's Inn. I know what you are because I have read, in your uncle's own ink, what he intended you to be. You may decide for yourself, in your own time, what you are instead." The carriage slowed. Mrs. Pickering's voice came through the panel. "The milestone, Your Grace." He nodded once, though she could not see him, and the carriage stopped. A small basket was passed in through the door, which opened only a hand's breadth, and was closed again before Diana could see the woman's face. He set the basket on the seat beside him and opened the lid. There was a half loaf, still warm, a stoneware bottle stoppered with a cork, 2 pewter cups, a small linen napkin. He tore the loaf with his hands. He did not ask whether she wished to be served. He simply offered her the larger portion across the space between them, balanced on the linen. She took it. She had thought she would not be able to swallow. The first bite was a stone in her throat. The second went down. By the third her hands had begun to shake, and she pressed her knees together hard to hide it. He poured a measure of the small wine into one of the cups and passed it. She drank. It was thin and slightly sour, and the most extraordinary thing she had ever tasted. He did not eat. He watched the curtain, not her. "He will pursue," she said. The bread had brought back her voice. "He will not let £30,000 drive away in a strange carriage without a chase. He will rouse the magistrate at Preston by noon. He will rouse no one. You speak as though you know him. I know his creditors." The cane turned once between the gloved hands. "By the time your uncle's grooms have saddled, a clerk will have presented a writ at his door. By the time he reaches the magistrate at Preston, the magistrate will be from home. By the time he writes to London, the post will be slow." He paused. "These are small inconveniences. They will not hold him for long, but they will hold him for today. Today is enough." She set the cup down on the seat beside her. She could feel the wine warming her hands at last. And Lord Mordaunt. The Duke's face did not move, but something behind his eyes did, the way a curtain moves a fraction in a closed room when a door has been opened elsewhere in the house. Lord Mordaunt, he said, is a separate matter. We will speak of him another day. You know him also. I know what he is. Then tell me. Not today. She felt heat rise into her cheeks for the first time since she had entered the carriage. It was not embarrassment, it was anger, clean and welcome, the first warm thing in her body that morning. You take me out of one man's house and into another's keeping, and you will not tell me on what ground. On the ground that you have not eaten since yesterday, and your hands are still shaking, and we have 11 hours of road ahead of us. His voice did not rise. I will tell you everything, Miss Egerton. I will tell you in a room with a fire and a chair and a door you may walk out of, if my answers do not please you. I will not tell you in a moving carriage on the second hour of an empty stomach. That is not gentleness. It is method. She held his gaze. He held hers. It was she who looked away first, and only because the carriage took another bend and the leather curtain swung and let in a brief blade of sun that crossed her eyes. 11 hours, she said. To Gloucestershire. Your house. Your house. One of them? She let out a small breath that was not quite a laugh, because there was no laughter left in her. And in Gloucestershire, there will be a fire, and a chair, and a door. There will be all three, and a housekeeper who will not love you, and a solicitor who will write down what you say, and a bed that is your own, behind a lock for which you alone will keep the key. And what shall I owe for the fire, and the chair, and the door? He looked at her then, fully, for the first time. The pale eyes did not soften, but they steadied on her face as though committing it to a list he had been writing for a long time. You will owe me, he said, the favor of standing once beside me, in a room of my choosing, on a night of my choosing, where certain persons will see you do it. That is all. After which, if you wish, my carriage will take you wherever you next have a mind to go, with such funds as will make the journey unembarrassed. Stand beside you. In a ballroom, in London, at the end of the season. Why? Because there are men in that ballroom who must be made to understand a thing, and the cheapest way to make a man understand a thing is to let him see it. And I am the thing. You are the witness. The cane moved a quarter turn in his hands. There is a difference. She did not answer. She could not, yet. She turned her face to the small, unsealed corner of the curtain, where a thread of countryside ran past in green and gray. They had left the Lancashire moors. The land was changing. A village steeple lifted and was gone. Inside her ribs something also lifted, very small, very tentative, a thing she had not felt in 3 years. It was not hope. It was not even relief. It was the lightness of a body that has just understood it will not, today, lie down beneath Lord Mordaunt. What he did not say, and what she did not yet ask, was the name of the woman whose face he had seen when he had first looked at her hair in the chapel doorway, and known that he would open the carriage door. She drew the gray cape from her shoulders at last, and folded it into her lap. The white silk of the wedding gown beneath was creased and stained at the hem. She looked down at it as though it belonged to someone she had once known, and would not see again. Your Grace, Miss Egerton, if at the end of the season I do not wish to stand beside you in that ballroom, what then? Then you will not stand there. And the carriage will still take me where I wish to go. It will. On your word. On my word. She nodded once. She did not offer her hand on it. She was a baronet's niece in a stolen servant's cape with mud on her slippers, and he was a duke with an ivory cane, and the thing between them was not yet a thing one sealed with a touch. Then I shall ride to Gloucestershire, she said, and I shall eat your bread, and I shall sleep behind your door, and tomorrow, when there is a fire and a chair, I shall ask you every question I have not been permitted to ask in my uncle's house for 3 years, and you, your Grace, will answer them. I shall answer them. All of them. A pause. The cane turned once more in his gloved hands. All of them that concern you. They will all concern me. For the first time since she had entered the carriage, the corner of his mouth lifted. It was not a smile. It was the small, unwilling movement of a man who has been spoken to in a tone he had not expected, and finds he does not mind it. Very well, Miss Egerton. He reached out and drew the small panel open at his shoulder. Mrs. Pickering, Tell Holroyd to spare the horses. We are no longer in haste. Your Grace. The panel slid shut. The carriage slowed by a fraction. The rushing river of the world outside the curtain became, at last, a road. Diana sat with the folded cape on her lap and the empty pewter cup beside her, and watched the thin blade of sun creep further along the floor with the lengthening of the morning. She did not know the man across from her. She did not know what was waiting in Gloucestershire. She did not know the name of the woman whose memory had set this carriage outside her uncle's chapel. But she knew, with a certainty as plain as the bread still warm in her hand, that she had not, after all, climbed into Lord Mordaunt's carriage. And somewhere behind them, in a chapel emptying of guests, a man with a cicatrice through his right eyebrow was being told, by a sweating curate, that the bride had not been found in the vestry, nor in the garden, nor in the lane, nor in any place where a bride might reasonably be. He did not shout. He set down his gloves on the altar rail, very carefully, one beside the other. He looked at the curate for a long moment, until the curate took a step back. Then he turned and walked out of the chapel into the bright, cold morning, and his eyes, when they reached the empty lane where the strange carriage had stood, were the color of a frozen pond at the hour before it cracks. He did not yet know the name on the panel of that carriage. By nightfall he would. The gates of Pelham House opened without a sound, as though the iron itself had been bribed into silence. Diana watched a long drive of crushed white stone unroll beyond the carriage window, lined by limes pruned into perfect columns. At its end stood a house the color of bone in winter light, 3 stories of pale Cotswold ashlar, every sash polished, every chimney smoking thin and even. The horses slowed of their own accord, knowing the gravel. The Duke had not spoken for the last hour. He sat as he had sat all morning, gloved hand closed loose over the silver fox-head of his cane, eyes on the middle distance, the prematurely silver thread at his right temple, catching what little sun came through. Diana noticed, because she was a woman accustomed to noticing what powerful men did with their hands, that his thumb had moved once across the engraved snout of the fox and then stilled. A small calculation completed. "You will be received," he said, as the carriage drew up at the south portico. "Do not curtsy to anyone but me until I tell you otherwise. I do not curtsy to men who abduct me, your Grace. Then we shall manage a nod." A footman in Pelham Green opened the door before the wheels had quite stopped. The Duke stepped down first. He did not offer his hand. He turned, however, and waited, and somehow the waiting was a hand. Diana climbed out in the housemaid's cloak with her bridal silk muddied to the knee, the Egerton signet cold on her smallest finger, and lifted her chin. A woman was already on the steps. Small, vertical, in black bombazine buttoned to the throat, a chatelaine of keys at her waist and a jet mourning brooch at her collar. The white muslin cap was so crisp it looked carved. She did not move down the steps to meet them. She made them come up. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the Duke said, "this is Miss Egerton. She is to be lodged in the South Rose suite. Mr. Trefusis will be here within the hour to register her under ducal protection." The housekeeper's eyes traveled, slow as a magistrate's, from Diana's filthy hem to her disheveled hair, where 2 white wedding flowers still clung like accusations. The pause lasted the breadth of 3 heartbeats. Then she sank into a curtsy of perfect, ironic depth, addressed entirely to the Duke. "As your Grace wishes." She did not say, "Miss." She did not say, "Welcome." The omission was as deliberate as the curtsy, and Diana, who had spent 6 years under her uncle's roof, learning to read the silences of servants, understood at once that she had acquired an enemy older than her own ambitions. "Mrs. Whitcomb served my mother," the Duke murmured as they crossed the checkered marble of the hall, "and then my sister." He did not say what he did not say was, "She has not forgiven the world for either." The South Rose suite proved to be 3 rooms hung in pale pink damask, with a window that looked over a walled garden where late roses still clenched their fists against autumn. A bath had already been drawn. 2 maids stood beside it with their hands folded and their eyes carefully on the carpet. On the bed lay a gown of dove-gray muslin, a fresh chemise, stockings, slippers. Every measurement, Diana saw at once, correct. She turned to the Duke in the doorway. "How long have you had my measurements?" 3 weeks. "My uncle gave them to you?" "Your uncle gave them to Lord Mordaunt's tailor. Lord Mordaunt's tailor has a clerk who owes a great deal to a man who owes a very small thing to me." "And the cloak in the chapel yard?" "A coincidence. The rest was not. She held his gaze. The gray-green eyes did not move. Then you did not save me, your grace. You collected me. I gave you a door, Miss Egerton. You ran through it. He bowed. Exactly the depth a duke owes a baronet's niece in his own house. No more, no less. And closed the door behind him. She did not weep. She had cried for the last time on the night she was 12, the night her father's coffin had been carried out through the kitchen because the front hall had already been claimed by his creditors. Tears were a currency she had decided long ago she could not afford to spend on men. Instead, she walked to the window. The walled garden lay below in low autumn light, gravel paths raked in herringbone, the rose stems pruned with a savagery that suggested someone in this house understood that beauty without discipline rotted. Beyond the wall, the parkland fell away to woods the color of beaten copper. She removed the housemaid's cloak. She removed the bridal silk, square by ruined square, until it lay on the carpet like a small white surrender. The maids came forward then, with the soundless competence of women who had been trained never to express opinion through their hands. They bathed her. They dressed her in the dove muslin. They combed the last of the wedding flowers out of her hair, gathered the dark auburn into a low knot, and offered her, on a silver salver, a single object, the Egerton signet she had laid aside on the washstand. His Grace said to tell you, miss, that it is your ring. She replaced it on her smallest finger. When she descended the staircase 40 minutes later, she was no longer a runaway bride. She was a young woman in a borrowed house, clean, fed, contained, and she had, in the hour of the bath, made 3 decisions that would shape every hour to come. She would not weep, she would not run, and she would not, under any circumstance, ask a duke for protection on terms she did not yet understand. She found him in the long library. It was a room built to humble its visitors. 2 stories of mahogany shelves, a gallery running its upper rim, a globe taller than a child, 2 great desks of green leather, and at the far end a fireplace large enough to roast a stag. The duke stood at one of the desks with a thin, ink-stained man in gray graphite who was unbuckling a brown leather case with double straps. Mr. Trefusis, the duke said without looking up. Miss Egerton. The solicitor lifted his head. Round steel-rimmed spectacles, a long nose, ink upon his fingers like old bruises. He bowed, low and precise, the bow of a man who served titles but read people. Miss Egerton, I am to register you, with your consent, as a guest of His Grace, under formal ducal protection. The document is a private one, lodged with my chambers in Lincoln's Inn. It places you, in the eyes of the law, neither as ward nor as betrothed, but as a person whose physical safety, lodging, and correspondence are the responsibility of His Grace, until you yourself revoke the arrangement in writing. And what does His Grace receive in return? Nothing, Miss Egerton. It is not a contract, it is a shield. Shields, she said, are held by someone, and the someone has reasons. Trefusis did not smile. He looked, briefly, at the Duke, in the way a chess master looks at the player he has been hired to assist. The Duke, who had not yet looked up from a stack of unopened letters, said quietly, "Sign it, Miss Egerton, or do not sign it. The carriage that brought you can take you to my aunt in Bath by nightfall. She is a stranger to your uncle, and a friend to no man with a coal mine. That is not a choice. That is a polite eviction. It is the choice I have." She crossed the carpet. She read the document. It was, as Trefusis had said, no more and no less than its words. She took the pen, dipped it, signed Diana Egerton in the small, clean hand her mother had taught her before the influenza took her, and laid the pen back in its tray. "Now," she said, "I should like, please, to see my uncle's books of credit." It was the first time, in the full hour, that the Duke looked at her directly. "I beg your pardon?" "Lord Egerton's debts, the notes of hand, whatever Lord Mordaunt holds, whatever you hold, whatever any of his creditors hold, I should like to see them. Today, if possible. Before supper, if not." A silence opened in the long room. Trefusis closed his case very slowly, as though afraid the brass tongues of the buckles might intrude on something delicate. The Duke set down the letter he had not been reading. "You wish to see your uncle's debts. I wish to see the price of myself, your Grace. 30,000 pounds was named in my hearing. I should like to know what was named out of it." Miss Egerton, many women in your circumstance would ask first for a doctor, or a maid, or for word to be sent to a friend. I have no friends my uncle has not already borrowed from. I do not require a doctor. I have a maid. I have, by your generosity, 3. She did not raise her voice. She kept her hands folded over the dove muslin as her mother had taught her. I require ledgers. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire in the great hearth cracked once, like a man clearing his throat to speak and thinking better of it. Trefusis, he said, bring the Egerton file, the Mordaunt file, everything we have from Coutts on the joint paper, and the Lancashire mortgages. Put it on the small desk. Have Mrs. Whitcomb send tea, and candles, and tell her Miss Egerton is not to be interrupted on any account until she rings. Tonight, your grace? Tonight? Trefusis bowed and went out. When the door closed, the Duke crossed to her with the small, soft tread he had used in the chapel yard, the tread of a man who had once been a soldier and could not quite remember not to be one. He stopped at a polite distance. You will not enjoy what you read. I have never enjoyed my uncle, your grace. I do not require to enjoy his arithmetic. There are things in those papers that touch my family, not only yours. Then I shall read those parts twice. Miss Egerton, a muscle moved once in his jaw and was disciplined. I had intended, when you were rested, when you were dressed, when you had had 2 days at least to forget the smell of the chapel, to ask one thing of you, one only, that you appear on my arm at Lady Honoria Langton's autumn ball in Berkeley Square 3 weeks from Friday, not as my betrothed, not as my ward, as Miss Egerton of Lancashire, my guest. That is all the use I require of you. Beyond that, your hours are your own, the library is your own. The horses are your own. I do not require your conversation at supper unless you offer it. 3 weeks from Friday. Yes. And in those 3 weeks, you will be taught what you do not know, which is, I suspect, very little. You will be measured for a gown the color of claret, because Lady Honoria's ballroom is hung in pale green, and a woman in claret cannot be overlooked in a pale green room. You will be lent diamonds. You will be presented to 2 countesses and 1 bishop, all of whom owe me favors, and none of whom will ask awkward questions. And on the night itself you will descend Lady Honoria's stair, take my arm, and not flinch. And then? And then a great many things will happen that do not require you to do anything at all, except stand beside me and breathe. She considered this. She considered him. You have not asked, she said, whether I will agree. No, Miss Egerton, I have not. Why? Because you have already read the room. You know that to refuse me tonight is to be sent to Bath by morning, and Bath is a town in which Lord Mordaunt has cousins. You know that to go home is to wake married before noon. You know that what I am offering you is not freedom, but a longer corridor with more doors in it. You will say yes, because you are a woman who counts doors. She did not answer at once. She walked, instead, to the small desk where Trefusis was already returning with the first of the files, an oxblood ledger, 2 Japan tin boxes, a fat leather portfolio tied with black tape. She laid her hand flat on the ledger. The leather was warm from being carried. You have miscalculated one thing, your grace. Have I? I am not saying yes because I count doors. I am saying yes because 3 weeks from Friday, I intend to walk into a ballroom in claret silk and watch the men who sold me discover, in public, what it cost to have sold me. If you happen to be the instrument by which they discover it, so much the better. But do not flatter yourself that I have understood you. I have understood my uncle. You I shall understand by morning. She sat down at the desk. She untied the black tape. The first page of the portfolio was a promissory note in her uncle's slanted, drink-thickened hand, made out to a moneylender in Preston for 800 guineas, dated the spring she had turned 16. She did not lift her head when the Duke spoke again, more quietly than before. Miss Egerton! Your Grace? Tea will be sent in, candles also. Mrs. Whitcomb has been instructed. Mrs. Whitcomb hates me. Mrs. Whitcomb hates the name on your ring. It is not, yet, the same thing. And when it becomes the same thing, then she and I shall have a conversation. She turned the page. He stood a moment longer at the edge of the lamp's reach, and she felt, without raising her eyes, the small adjustment in his weight that meant he had decided to leave her to it. The cane tapped once on the parquet, soft as a closing parenthesis. The library door shut. She was alone with 3,000 pounds of mahogany, 4 candles, an ox-blood ledger, and the entire account of how she had been sold. She began to read. She read through the tea Mrs. Whitcomb sent in herself, set down upon the desk with a silence so pointed it could have been entered as evidence in any court. She read through the trimming of the candles. She read past the great clock striking 11, and midnight, and 1. She read her uncle's signature 37 times. She read Lord Mordaunt's twice, once on a marriage settlement dated a fortnight before her 17th birthday, the ink so fresh upon the parchment that she could see the press of the quill, and once on a separate paper she did not at first understand, a letter of acknowledgement, addressed not to her uncle, but to a man named only as C.B., Duke of Pelham. The letter was 4 years old. It thanked his grace for the discreet purchase of a certain debt. It promised, in oily formal hand, that the matter of the late Lady Constance shall never again be spoken of in any quarter where it might give pain. Diana set the paper down very carefully, as one sets down a thing that might cut. She rose from the desk. The fire had sunk to red bones. The clock said 20 past 2. Somewhere above her, in this house she had been in for less than a day, a duke who had a sister called Constance was sleeping, or not sleeping, behind a door she had not yet seen. She lifted the candle. She picked up the letter. She walked, in dove-gray muslin and stockinged feet, across the cold parquet of the long library to the door, and out into the great hall, and up the curving stair, the candle's light moving along banisters older than her grandfather. She did not know which room was his, she did not need to. A line of yellow light showed beneath one door at the head of the gallery. She walked towards it as evenly as she had walked, that morning, away from a chapel. She raised her hand and knocked, once. Behind the door, a chair scraped against the floor, soft and immediate, the sound of a man who had not been asleep at all. The door opened before her hand had fallen all the way to her side. Cassius stood there in his shirt sleeves, the cravat loosened at his throat, the silver fox of his cane still glinting in his right hand, as though even sleep had not been permitted to disarm him. He did not look surprised. He looked, Diana thought, like a man who had been waiting through the hours for precisely this knock, and had only required her to arrive at it on her own. He stepped back. He did not speak. Diana entered the library carrying the heavy red ledger against her ribs, her fingers cold around its spine, and she walked past him to the long mahogany table, where a single candle still burned in its silver dish. She set the ledger down. The cover struck the wood with a small, deliberate sound, and she watched his face for the flinch that did not come. "Sit down, Your Grace," she said. He raised the fine line of one brow. The cane lifted half an inch from the carpet, settled again. Then, slowly, he crossed the room and drew out the chair opposite her own, and lowered himself into it with the careful economy of a man who knew his height could intimidate by accident. Diana remained standing. She turned the ledger so the spine faced him, opened it to a page she had marked with the green ribbon from her own waist, and laid her palm flat across the entry. Her hand was steady. She had been surprised an hour ago to find that it was steady. "This account," she said, "was opened in the spring of 1812 in the name of Lord Reginald Egerton of Lancashire. The first deposit against it was £3,000, drawn from the Pelham estate by your own hand. The last entry is dated the 3rd of December, 1814. The week, Your Grace, that your sister was buried." The silence that followed was not empty. It had a weight to it, the way the air had weight before a thunderstorm broke over the moor. The candle guttered and recovered. Somewhere far below them in the great house, a clock began to strike 4, and Diana counted the strokes without looking away from his face. "You knew her name," he said. It was not a question. "Lady Constance Bourchier. There is a portrait in the long gallery. I passed it on my way here. She has your mouth." He did not deny it. He set the cane across his knees and folded his hands over the silver fox, and Diana saw the white of his knuckles before she saw anything else. "How long," she asked, "had you been planning this?" 3 years. "And in those 3 years," she said, "did it ever occur to you to inform the woman you intended to use as your blade that she was being sharpened?" He looked up then. His eyes in the candlelight were the color of pewter under rain, and Diana found that she could meet them without flinching, which astonished her more than anything else that had happened since she had left the chapel. "I did not know," he said, "that you would be the woman in the carriage." "You knew that some woman would be, Yes, any niece of his would have served. Any niece of his would have been delivered to Mordaunt by his hand, Cassius said, and any niece of his would have been ruined within the year. I have made certain of Mordaunt's habits. I have made certain of his temper. I have made certain of what becomes of the women he buys. So yes, Miss Egerton, any niece would have served. I am not in the habit of dressing a thing up to be prettier than it is. She let that sit between them. The truth of it did not surprise her. The plainness with which he said it did. Tell me about her, Diana said. He closed his eyes for the span of a breath. When he opened them, the room had not changed, but something in the angle of his shoulders had. She was 23, he said. She had a laugh that carried across a ballroom. She believed your uncle when he told her that her brother would never object to a private engagement, because her brother loved her. She believed him when he produced a special license. She believed him when he said the witnesses had been arranged. There were no witnesses. There was no license. There was a parson he had drunk with at a Lancashire faro table, and a ceremony in a hired room in Cheapside, and a child by the autumn, and a fever by the December, and a letter from him to me in January, refusing to pay the doctor's bill on the grounds that no marriage had occurred. Diana sat down. She had not meant to. Her knees had simply decided the matter without her. He buried her in the parish of St. Giles, Cassius continued, in the same level voice, in an unmarked grave, because the rector would not permit a Bourchier marker over a woman the law did not recognize as Bourchier. I had her moved that spring. There is a stone now in the Pelham Chapel. You will see it if you stay. And the child? Stillborn, a daughter. She was buried in her mother's arms before her mother had been washed. Diana did not look away. She had thought, in the carriage on the long road from Lancashire to Gloucestershire, that nothing in this house could be worse than what had been waiting for her in Mordaunt's bed. She had been wrong about that, and she allowed herself to know it. The candle had burned down a finger's breadth while he spoke. Diana looked at her own hand against the open page and found that it had curled into a small fist without her consent. So you bought his debts, she said. I bought every paper he signed, every promissory note he scattered through the clubs, every mortgage he raised against land he had already mortgaged twice. I bought the lease of the house in Lancashire. I bought the carriage that brought him to chapel yesterday morning. I bought the license of the parson, who would have stood over you and Mordaunt. There is not a stitch of cloth on your uncle's back, Miss Egerton, that I do not technically own. And Mordaunt? Mordaunt is the door I have been waiting for him to walk through. Your uncle could be ruined 100 ways. The mines, however, are Mordaunt's, and the mines are the only thing in Lancashire worth taking. So your uncle was permitted to gamble until he had nothing left but a niece, and Mordaunt was permitted to offer £30,000 for her, and the contracts were drawn in such a way that the failure of the marriage on the morning of the marriage would trigger every note I hold. Yesterday at 10:30, when you did not say "I will," both men became mine. She glanced at the ledger between them, at the long column of dates that stretched across 3 years like the line of a slow siege. She thought of her uncle counting Mordaunt's coins on the table at Lancashire, while she remended the petticoat in the corner. She thought of how small that scene had seemed at the time, and how small it still seemed, and how it had nonetheless cost a young woman her life, and an infant girl her name. By 10:30, Diana said quietly, I was in your carriage. Yes. Which means, she said, that you have had what you wanted since yesterday morning. The notes are due. Your sister is avenged. Why am I still in this house, Your Grace? He did not answer. The cane shifted across his knees. The candle leaned toward him as some small draught passed through the room, and Diana watched the flame bend and right itself, and then she leaned forward across the table until the ledger lay between them like a small red wall. You brought me here to use me as a knife, she said. I have read the papers. I have done the sums. I know what it serves you to walk into Lady Honoria's ballroom with an Egerton on your arm. I understand the geometry of it. What I do not understand, Your Grace, is why for the last 6 hours, in the room across the hall where I should have been weeping, you have been awake. His hand tightened on the silver fox. Why are you hesitating? She said. For the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Pelham looked away. He set the cane against the leg of the table. He lowered it the way a soldier lowers a rifle when he has decided he is done with the field. The wood touched the carpet without a sound. Diana saw his shoulders shift as the weight of it left his hand, and she understood, before he spoke, that something had moved in the room which neither of them would be able to put back. Because, he said, when I planned this, I did not plan for a woman who would walk into a library at 4 in the morning carrying my ledger and ask me what I owed her. You owe me an answer. I am giving you one. I want the rest of it. He looked back at her. The pewter eyes had darkened. The candle had burned almost to its socket, and in the failing light his face seemed younger than it had been an hour ago, and harder, and more uncertain at once. I thought, he said, that I would marry whichever niece arrived. I thought I would set her up in a house in Bath when the season ended. I thought she would be grateful and silent and never enter this library, because no woman of your uncle's blood would have the wit to read a ledger. I thought I would carry the rest of it alone for the rest of my life. That was the arrangement I made with myself in Constance's chapel 3 years ago, and I have not deviated from it by an inch until you knocked on that door. And now? And now, he said, I do not know what I am doing, Miss Egerton, and that is a thing I have not said aloud to any living person since my sister was lowered into the ground. Diana sat very still. Outside the library windows, the first grey of the Gloucestershire morning was beginning to lift the edge of the lawn out of the dark. She heard the rooks stirring in the elms by the gatehouse. She heard, distantly, the kitchen door open below as a scullery maid carried out the ashes. The house was waking. In 2 hours, Mrs. Whitcomb would knock with chocolate she did not believe Diana deserved. In 4 hours, Mr. Trefusis would arrive from London with the papers that would carry the next move forward. The world Cassius had built around her would resume its motion, and she would be expected to take her place inside it as the small, bright blade he had drawn from her uncle's hand. She reached across the ledger. She did not take his hand. She laid her own palm flat upon the table, 3 inches from his, fingers spread, the Egerton signet bare on her smallest finger, and she let it rest there. Then we will not pretend, she said, that you brought me here for a single reason. You brought me here for one reason, and you have kept me here for another, and the second reason is the one you cannot yet name. Very well, I will not ask you to name it tonight. Miss Egerton, I will ask you instead, Your Grace, to teach me. I have read your books. I want to read your correspondence. I want to know the names of every man whose paper you hold, and the dates of every note, and the price of every silence you have purchased between Lancashire and London. If I am to stand beside you at Lady Honoria's ball in claret silk and Pelham diamonds, I will not stand there as a knife you carry. I will stand there as a partner who knows the field. That is not what a wife does. I am not your wife, Your Grace. You have not asked me, and I have not answered. He looked at her hand on the table. He looked at her face. For a long moment he did not move, and Diana watched the candle finally drown in its own wax and the room shift to the color of slate, and then she saw him do a thing she had not believed him capable of. He smiled. It was a small, exhausted, almost rueful smile, and it touched the old scar at the corner of his mouth, and it altered him. Mr. Trefusis arrives at 10, he said. I will instruct him to bring the London ledgers as well. Thank you. Miss Egerton. Your Grace. What you have done tonight, he said, no one else has done, not Mrs. Whitcomb, not Trefusis, not Lady Honoria, who has known me since I was in short coats. They have all carried portions of it. None of them has sat down across from me and required the whole. Someone needed to. Yes. She rose. She closed the red ledger. She did not return it to the shelf. She set it instead in the center of the table, where the light, when it came through the eastern windows, would fall upon it, and she felt his eyes on her hands as she did it. At the door she paused. You lowered your cane, she said. I noticed. So did I. She left him there, in the gray light, with his hand still resting where the silver fox had been, and she walked back down the long corridor to her own room. And she did not weep, and she did not sleep. And when Mrs. Whitcomb knocked 2 hours later with the chocolate, she did not believe Diana deserved. Diana was already dressed in the plain morning gown the housekeeper had grudgingly provided, seated at the writing desk by the window, sharpening a pen. Mrs. Whitcomb set the tray down very carefully, as though it might break. His Grace requests your presence in the library at 10, she said. The words came out flatter than she had intended them, and Diana heard the small fissure run through them, and did not remark upon it. I shall be there at 1:45, Diana said. Mr. Trefusis is bringing the London ledgers, and I should like to be reading when he arrives. The chocolate cup trembled, very slightly, on its saucer. Mrs. Whitcomb withdrew. At the door she paused, and her hand rested for a long moment on the brass of the handle, and then she said, without turning, "Lady Constance also rose early, miss," and she closed the door behind her. Diana sat for a long time without moving. Then she dipped the pen, drew a sheet of paper toward her, and began, in her small precise hand, to copy out from memory every figure she had read in the red ledger between midnight and 4. By the time the bell rang for breakfast, she had filled 3 pages. She folded them, sealed them with a wafer she found in the drawer, and addressed the packet, not to herself and not to the Duke, but to Mr. Silas Trefusis, Lincoln's Inn, London, to be opened only in the event of her death. She slid the packet into the lining of her traveling case. She pressed the lining flat. She closed the case and turned the small brass key and slipped the key inside the hem of her sleeve, where the seam she had stitched herself in Lancashire still held against the pull of her wrist. Some inheritances, she thought, were not red ledgers and not unmarked graves. Some inheritances were a needle drawn through cloth at midnight, and a hand that did not shake when the candle finally drowned, and the small private knowledge that a woman who had once been a price could become, by morning, a witness. Then she went down to the library to meet the man who had lowered his cane and the solicitor who would teach her how to hold one of her own. The Morning Post arrived at Pelham House in Grosvenor Square on a Tuesday, folded twice and pressed flat under the silver salver, and Diana opened it before the chocolate had cooled in its pot. The page smelled of fresh ink and oil. Her eyes found the column without searching. The letter occupied half a sheet, set in heavy type, signed by Lord Henry Mordaunt of Mordaunt Hall, Lancashire, and addressed to every gentleman of England who still possessed a conscience. She read it standing. He named the chapel. He named the hour. He named her uncle's grief, invented for the occasion, and described the carriage as black with no crest, drawn by 4 greys, in which a duke of ancient title had carried off a bride from beneath the very veil. He did not write the duke's name. He did not need to. He wrote only that a peer of the highest rank had grown so accustomed to taking what he wished that he had at last begun to take wives. Diana set the paper down. Her fingers were steady. That surprised her more than the letter. Mrs. Whitcomb entered with the second tray and saw the page and saw the girl above it, and her mouth thinned into the shape it had worn since the first morning in Gloucestershire. "His Grace has read it," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "He took it into the study an hour ago. He let me sleep through it. He gave orders that you should." Diana lifted the cup at last and drank, because her hands required occupation. The chocolate was cold. She drank it anyway. Through the long window the square was already filling with carriages, more than usual for the hour, and several of them slowed as they passed the Pelham gates. By 11 the cards began to arrive. 2 cards, only 2. Lady Carrington, who had promised the previous afternoon to call upon Miss Egerton before the season's first concert, sent her footman with a folded square of pasteboard bearing a single line in pencil, "Regret, indisposed, another day." The second came from Mrs. Forsyth Beale, who had embraced Diana at the modistes on Bond Street 3 days ago and named her a darling, and now sent word that her mother had been taken ill in Bath and the household was in mourning preparation. Diana laid the cards side by side on the writing table. She did not need to ask Mrs. Whitcomb what it meant. The housekeeper stood very straight by the door and said nothing, which itself was a kind of saying. "Have any others come?" Diana asked. "None, miss." "Were any expected?" A pause. "4, miss, before the post." Diana looked at the cards a moment longer. Then she crossed to the bell and rang it. "Send for Mr. Trefusis, and tell his Grace I should like to see the morning's appointment book." Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head a fraction. As she turned at the door she paused, as though against her own judgment, and her voice when it came was lower and rougher than the room had heard from her before. "It is not only the letter, miss." "What else, then?" "They have begun to remember whose niece you are. That is all I shall say of it." She went out. Diana sat very still. The mantel clock ticked 9 strokes before she rose. She found Cassius in the study, the paper opened on the desk before him, the silver-headed cane laid across the blotter. He did not stand when she entered. He looked up, and something moved behind the pale gray-green of his eyes which she had not seen there before. It was not surprise. It was, she thought, the briefest possible apology. "You should not have read it before breakfast," he said. I read it instead of breakfast. 2 of my 4 callers have indisposed themselves. The other 2 have not troubled to refuse. I am aware. Then you will not waste my morning telling me it is nothing. He almost smiled. He did not quite. I was going to tell you it is precisely what we expected. Mordaunt has £30,000 owing to your uncle's creditors, and he has, by yesterday's reckoning, no liquid means of paying them. He cannot fight me with law. He has therefore chosen ink. He has chosen me. He has chosen the easier mark, yes. She did not flinch at that. She had decided, somewhere between the writing table and this room, that flinching was a luxury for women whose names had not been printed in the Morning Post by 9:30. "Trefusis is coming," she said. "I have already sent for him." I sent for him first. Cassius did look up then, fully, and the small dark thing behind his expression sharpened into something that was almost recognition. He inclined his head. Then he comes twice the more quickly. Trefusis came within the hour. He carried the brown leather folio under his arm, as always, and he did not waste a syllable on the letter. He set 3 sheets upon the desk before Diana and 1 before the Duke, and spoke directly to her, which neither of them remarked upon, though both of them noticed. "Miss Egerton, the letter is actionable in 3 particulars and worthless in 2. We shall not pursue it. To answer it in print is to dignify it. To answer it in court is to keep your name 3 months in the news sheets. We shall therefore answer it in person, in one evening, at Lady Honoria's ball. That is in 11 days. 10 now, miss. We have been counting." She looked at him. He looked back through the round steel spectacles without blinking, and she understood for the first time that the solicitor was not in the room to comfort her. He was in the room because she had asked, and he had come because she, not the Duke, had asked. The distinction sat oddly inside her chest. In a small, warm place she had not known was empty. "Then tell me what I must do in 10 days. You must be seen, miss. Not often. Not eagerly. 3 times, in 3 places, on the Duke's arm. You will not return the cards of those who did not come this morning. You will not write to your aunt at Bath. You will be observed at the opera on Thursday, in the park on Saturday, at the unfashionable hour, and at Lady Honoria's ball with the Pelham diamonds about your throat. The rest is mine. And what is yours, Mr. Trefusis?" He glanced once at Cassius. Cassius said nothing. Trefusis looked back at her. "Your uncle's debts, miss, are mine. Lord Mordaunt's mines are mine. I have had men in Lancashire since the morning after the chapel. By Lady Honoria's ball I shall have in this folio the instruments by which both gentlemen cease to be gentlemen. You will permit me, on that night, to open it in the company of their creditors." Diana folded her hands on the desk. The signet ring of the Egertons was no longer on her smallest finger. She had taken it off in Gloucestershire and laid it in a tortoise-shell box on her dressing table, and she had not put it on again. "Permit you," she repeated. "It is my family you are dismantling." "Yes, miss. Then I should like to be in the room when it happens." "You will be, miss, at the center of it." The opera came and went. She wore pale rose silk and the Pelham pearls, not yet the diamonds. She sat in the box and did not look down once into the pit, and she felt the lorgnons rise and fall along the tiers like a tide. Cassius spoke to her perhaps 4 times in the course of 3 acts, low remarks about the soprano's intonation and the conductor's tempi, and each time he spoke, she answered as though they had been married 7 years and had grown content with one another's silences. The box opposite emptied at the 2nd interval. The box adjoining filled with curious eyes. By the 3rd interval a dowager in puce had bowed to her from the floor of the corridor. By the end of the evening 2 matrons had asked, through intermediaries, whether Miss Egerton would receive on Friday. Diana said nothing of the small triumph as the carriage rolled home through the lamps of Piccadilly. Cassius looked once at her gloved hand on the velvet seat and did not take it. She did not offer it. They understood one another now in a manner that did not require touching. The park on Saturday was worse and better. Worse because the wind was thin and cutting and carried gossip the length of Rotten Row faster than horses. Better because she rode beside the Duke on a chestnut mare Mrs. Whitcomb had chosen for her, and she held the reins as her aunt at Bath had taught her at 12, and she did not look at the riders who turned their horses' heads as she passed. Lady Honoria herself drove the length of the row in a barouche of lavender lacquer and stopped beside them, and through the open window she said, loudly enough to be heard at 50 paces, "My dear Miss Egerton, You will sit beside me at supper on the 28th. I shall be most put out if you decline." Diana inclined her head and said she should be honored. Lady Honoria's lorgnon swept the riders behind her like a scythe, and 4 heads turned away at once, and the barouche moved on. That evening Diana came down to the small dining room of the London house and found Mrs. Whitcomb arranging the candles herself, which she did only when she was angry. "There is a thing you should know," Mrs. Whitcomb said, without preamble, without lifting her eyes from the silver. "There are many things. This one I should have told you in Gloucestershire and did not, and that was my failing." She placed the last taper. Her hands were quite steady. "Lady Constance Berthier was 20 when your uncle ruined her. She was 21 when she died of the fever after the child. The child also died. Your uncle was at the tables in Lancashire that week. He did not come. He sent no letter. He sent, 2 months after, a bill to his Grace for the lease upon a cottage he claimed she had occupied, and that bill is in the folio Mr. Trefusis carries." Diana did not move. "You have the same blood as the man who would not come. Miss, I have stood in this house 31 years. I cared for her ladyship from the day she was brought home in a brougham wrapped in a shawl. I will not pretend, even now, that I do not see her eyes when I look at yours. It is not your fault. It is only the truth of it, and his Grace, Miss, who has not slept a full night these 6 years, has chosen to see something else in you, and I am old enough to know that what he sees may yet be the thing he loses. I have said it. I shall not say it again." She turned to leave. At the door she paused without turning. "The diamonds are laid out, miss, for the ball. They are not Lady Constance's. He had new ones made." She went out. Diana sat down very slowly at the long polished table where no one yet had brought food. The candles burned even. The clock above the hearth told 7:15. She placed her hands flat upon the mahogany and felt the cold of it through her palms. She had known, of course. She had read it in the ledgers in Gloucestershire, by the lamp at 4 in the morning. She had said the words aloud to Cassius in the library. She had thought she had understood. She had not understood. To read a thing is one matter. To be told it across a candlestick by a woman who had washed the dead girl's body is another. She did not weep. Weeping had been useful once, in a chapel, as a means of being left alone. It was not useful here. She rose and went up to the dressing room where the diamonds lay upon black velvet under a single shaded lamp. 3 rows of stones in cascade, the Pelham collar, made new. She did not touch them. She looked at them a long minute. Then she went back down to the study and stood in the doorway and said to Cassius, who was bent over a map of Lancashire, "I am going alone to the ball if you cannot tell me, before that night, that you trust me to be there." He raised his head. "I have always trusted you to be there." "You have used me to be there. That is not the same." He set down the pencil. He did not stand. The silver fox's head of the cane caught the lamplight at the edge of the desk, and his hand rested upon it as it always did, but his hand was not quite still. Diana. It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it and did not let her face change. "You will wear the diamonds," he said, "because they were made for you, not for her. They were drawn by my own hand the week after you read the ledgers, and the stones were set by Store in Bond Street, and Mrs. Whitcomb knows it, and she told you because she would have me tell you, and I would not. I have not slept these 6 years. That is true. I have lately begun to sleep. That is also true. Whether you wear the collar or not, you are not the knife. You stopped being the knife on the night you asked for the ledgers. I should have said so then. I am saying so now, because if I do not say so before that ball, you will go down those stairs believing yourself a borrowed object, and you will not survive what waits at the foot of them." She held the door frame. Her knuckles were white against the dark wood. She did not move into the room. "And if I do survive it, then on the morning after," he said, "you will tell me what you wish to do, and I shall do it. Whether that is to return to Gloucestershire, or to go to Bath, or to walk out of this house and never enter it again. You are not bound to me by the carriage. You were never bound to me by the carriage. Mordaunt has tried, this fortnight, to bind you to me by a letter in the post. He has failed. He has only loosed you further. I am asking you to wear the diamonds because they are yours. Nothing else of this house need be." She did not answer. She could not, for a moment, find her voice. She inclined her head once. She turned and went back up the stairs. In her own room, she sat upon the edge of the bed without lighting a candle, and the dusk came in through the long sash window and lay gray across the counterpane. She thought of the chapel and the muddy slipper and the door of the wrong carriage swinging open into the rain. She thought of her uncle at the tables in Lancashire. She thought of a girl of 20 in a cottage with no letter. She thought of Mrs. Whitcomb folding linen for 31 years and saying nothing until tonight. She found she could not, after all, hold all of it at once. She lay back upon the counterpane in her dinner silk and looked at the ceiling, where the plaster medallion bore a wreath of roses, and she let the breath leave her slowly. The ball was in 9 days. She had not eaten since the chocolate at 8:30 that morning. Below, somewhere in the longhouse, a clock struck the hour, and another, half a beat behind, answered. She heard the front door open and close and a carriage pull away from the curb, and she knew without rising that it was Trefusis going back to Lincoln's Inn, with the folio under his arm, and one more name written into it. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She did, however, make a decision, and the decision was very small and very quiet and entirely her own, and she made it without telling the Duke, and without telling Mrs. Whitcomb, and without telling the solicitor, with the ink-stained fingers. She would wear the diamonds, she would go down the stairs, she would stand at the center of the room when the folio was opened, and when it was done, when her uncle had been let out and Mordaunt had been turned into the street, she would decide, alone and for the first time, what came next. It was not yet a triumph, it was not yet even a plan, it was only the shape of a woman who had been sold for £30,000 and had begun, in the quiet of a borrowed room in Grosvenor Square, to refuse the sale. Outside the window, the lamps of the square came on one by one along the iron railings, and somewhere a link boy called the hour, and the dusk turned the color of claret silk not yet cut from the bolt. The morning of the ball arrived without ceremony, the way significant mornings often do. Diana woke before the maids and stood at the window of the Grosvenor Square house in her shift, watching a coal cart rattle past the iron railings. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Cassius was already awake. She had learned, in the past fortnight, to read his presence in a house by the sound of a cane setting itself down on marble. She dressed herself in a plain morning gown of gray muslin, because the claret silk and the diamonds did not yet belong to her, and a thing not yet hers must be approached as a guest, not as a possessor. The maid Hester came in with chocolate and a folded card on a silver salver. The card was from Lady Honoria. Berkeley Square. The old woman had written in a hand like a fencer's lunge. 11 o'clock tonight. You will descend the stair on the Duke's arm. You will not falter. I have arranged the guest list. Diana read it twice. Then she folded the card, slid it under the chocolate pot, and went down to the breakfast room. Cassius was at the long table with the Morning Post open and uncut bread untouched beside his cup. Trefusis stood at his elbow with the brown leather case under one arm, the double buckles already loosened. They both looked up when she came in. Neither rose, which was the closest thing to family she had been granted in months. It is done, Trefusis said. The writs are signed. The bills are with the bailiffs. Lord Egerton has been quietly noticed at his lodgings in Half Moon Street. Mordaunt does not yet know that 2 of the 3 mines have changed hands. When does he know? Diana asked. Tonight, Cassius said. At Berkeley Square, in the long gallery, between the second cotillion and the supper dance. She poured herself tea. Her hand did not shake, which surprised her, and then it did not surprise her. Do I need to do anything? Walk down the stair, he said. Take my arm. Look at the room as if you have always belonged in it. The rest is Trefusis and the law. And Mordaunt? Cassius set down his cup. The silver fox of his cane caught the light. Mordaunt, I will speak to myself. Trefusis cleared his throat in the way of a man who had drafted enough conversations to know which ones were better not described in advance, and excused himself. The breakfast room emptied of everyone but the 2 of them, and a footman who pretended very hard to be furniture. I have a question, Diana said. Ask it. If the writs are signed, and the bills are with the bailiffs, and Mrs. Whitcomb has accepted me, and Lady Honoria has placed me on the stair, what is the ball for? He looked at her for a long moment. The gray of his eyes had silver in it that morning. The ball, he said, is for you. She did not answer that. She buttered a piece of bread she did not eat, and watched a sparrow in the area railings, and felt the day arrange itself around her like a gown being lifted from a chest. By 6 in the evening, the house had become a workshop. 2 hairdressers worked on her in the dressing room, and Hester laced her into stays so light she could breathe, and a Frenchwoman from Bond Street brought the claret gown in a long box lined with cambric. The silk had the weight of a serious decision. The gold thread on the bodice caught lamplight like wheat in a low sun, long white gloves to the elbow, sapphire-colored shoes she would not have chosen and which were exactly right. When Mrs. Whitcomb brought the case of diamonds, she did so herself. She did not entrust it to a maid. She set it on the dressing table with both hands and stepped back. "The Pelham collar," she said. 3 rows. It was last worn by Lady Constance. Diana met her eyes in the looking-glass. "Then I shall wear it carefully," she said. Mrs. Whitcomb did not smile. She inclined her head, which from her was nearly the same thing, and clasped the necklace at Diana's nape with fingers older than the diamonds. At 11:15, the carriage drew up at the curb of Berkeley Square. Cassius handed her down. He wore black with a waistcoat of mossy green, and the silver fox in his hand caught the torchlight at the door. He did not offer her words. He offered her the inside of his arm, and she laid her gloved hand on it, and they went up the steps together. The hall was already full. The staircase rose in a sweep of white marble and brass, and at its head Lady Honoria stood in lavender silk and a turban that would have toppled a smaller woman. She lifted her lorgnon, looked once at Diana, and let the lorgnon fall on its chain. "Announce them," she said to her major domo, in a voice that carried. The major domo struck the floor with his staff. His Grace the Duke of Pelham, Miss Egerton of Lancashire. 1,000 candles, 100 faces, the small avalanche of silence that precedes a turn of fortune in a room. Diana set her hand on the marble banister. She did not look down at her feet. She looked at the far wall, where a portrait of a long-dead earl watched the stair with painted indifference, and she descended on Cassius's arm 1 step at a time. Halfway down, she heard a fan snap shut. Halfway down, she heard a woman murmur, "That is the bride." Halfway down, she did not falter. At the foot of the stair, Lady Honoria took both her hands. "My dear," the old woman said, loud enough for the front rank to hear, "I have been longing to present you. Come, there are some persons here who do not yet understand whom they have been refusing to receive. Way." The dancing began. Cassius led her through the first set himself, which was a thing he had not done at a public ball in 11 years, and the room understood. The second set he gave her to Lord Honoria's nephew, who was charming and a little frightened, and Cassius stepped back to the gallery doors and waited. Trefusis appeared at his shoulder with the case. Diana, between dances, was led by Lady Honoria from one knot of women to the next. The 2 visiting cards that had been returned to the Pelham house a fortnight earlier belonged to women who were now in this room, and Lady Honoria walked her past them slowly, smiling, naming nobody. The women named themselves, eventually, in lowered voices to one another, and by the time Diana had passed the 3rd group, her presence had become a thing the room agreed to acknowledge. A countess who had cut her in Bond Street pressed a glove against her own throat as Diana went by. A young viscountess who had laughed about her in a barouche curtsied and was not curtsied back to. These were small justices. Diana counted them and did not smile. Lord Henry Mordaunt arrived at 11:30. He came in with 2 friends in regimentals and a face arranged for a confrontation he believed himself to be authoring. He had not been on the guest list. Lady Honoria had arranged that he be admitted anyway. There were certain humiliations that required a room. He saw Diana in claret silk under the Pelham diamonds, and the color left him in 2 stages, first the lips and then the rest. He pushed through a knot of dowagers and made for the center of the floor. Cassius moved before Mordaunt reached her. He did not hurry. He simply walked, with the silver-headed cane in his right hand, and met Mordaunt 3 paces in front of where Diana stood, with her glove resting on the back of a gilt chair. "Pelham," Mordaunt said. His voice was loud enough to gather a circle. "I will have her back." The settlements were signed. The banns were read. "She is, in any court of this realm, my wife in everything but name." Cassius did not raise his voice. That was the thing the room remembered afterwards. "She is not your wife," he said. "She is my guest, and you, sir, are not what you were this morning." He laid the cane lightly across Mordaunt's chest. Not a blow, a barrier, a line drawn on a floor. "Mr. Trefusis," Cassius said. Trefusis stepped forward into the cleared circle with the case open in his hands. He spoke as though reading a parish register. "By writ of this afternoon, The leases on the Mordaunt collieries at Wigan and at Pemberton have been called in by the principal creditor, who is now the Duke of Pelham. The third pit, at Hindley, has been attached against unpaid debts owed to Coutts and to the heirs of Mr. Joseph Anstey, deceased. As of 6 o'clock this evening, Lord Henry Mordaunt is the proprietor of none of them. The silence in the gallery was not a silence. It was a sound, the sound of 200 people deciding, all at once, what they had always thought of Lord Mordaunt. "You cannot," Mordaunt said. "It is done," Cassius said, and in the same hour, by separate writ, the debts of Lord Reginald Egerton of Lancashire have been called in by the same creditor. Lord Egerton is, at this moment, in conversation with 2 officers of the court at his lodgings in Half Moon Street. He will not be at home to callers tomorrow. He will not be at home to callers, I think, for some time. Mordaunt looked at Diana. He looked at her as a man looks at a door that has closed. "You think this protects her," he said. "You think the ton will forget what she did at the chapel." Lady Honoria stepped into the circle then. She did not lift her lorgnon. She lifted her chin, which in her case was the more dangerous instrument. "Lord Mordaunt," she said, "you are not on my list. I do not know who admitted you. I shall discover it and dismiss them. In the meantime, my footman will see you to the door, without your coat, I think. The night is mild, and the walk to your carriage is short, and a man without £30,000 and without 3 coal mines does not, I find, require a coat as urgently as he supposed." 2 footmen in Langton livery were already at Mordaunt's elbows. He looked once more at Diana. She did not lower her eyes. She did not raise her chin. She simply looked, the way Lady Constance might have looked once, from a portrait she would never sit for. He was taken out through the side passage. The orchestra, which had stopped, was nodded at by Lady Honoria, and began again, very softly, the opening bars of a country dance that nobody for the moment was dancing. Cassius turned to Diana. He offered his arm again. She took it. "There is a garden," he said. "I know," she said. They walked the length of the gallery together. The room did not part for them so much as reassemble around them, the way water closes after a stone. Behind them, Lady Honoria was already beginning, in a voice perfectly pitched, to tell 3 duchesses how charming dear Miss Egerton had been on the stair, and how like her late mother she looked, which was a thing none of the 3 duchesses had ever thought before, and would now think for the rest of their lives. The garden of Pelham House was at the back of Berkeley Square, reached by a passage between 2 houses Lady Honoria owned, and a wrought-iron gate Lady Honoria had had unlocked. There was a stone bench beneath an arbor, and roses in bloom past their season, because Cassius's gardener was vain about such things. The night was mild, as Lady Honoria had said. Above the rooftops a half-moon hung low and clean. Cassius set the cane against the bench. He did not sit. Diana stood with one gloved hand on the cool stone of the arbor, and waited. He took something from the inside pocket of his coat. It was small. It was a ring. It was the Egerton signet. "Trefusis took it from your uncle's finger this afternoon," he said, "before the officers came in. He thought you should have it returned. The barony is forfeit. The estate is forfeit. But the ring was your grandfather's, and before that your grandmother's, and it was not your uncle's to lose." He held it out on his open palm. She drew off the long white glove of her left hand, slowly, finger by finger, the way one undoes a knot one intends never to retie. She held out her hand to him. He slid the ring onto her smallest finger, where it had sat the morning she climbed into the wrong carriage. He kept her hand a moment after. "Marry me," he said. "Because you took me from the chapel?" she asked. "No." "Because the ton will forget faster if I am a duchess?" "No." "Then why?" He looked at her. The silver in his eyes, the prematurely silvered fox at his temple, the thin old scar at his lip. She had memorized all of these without meaning to. "Because this morning," he said, "you were not certain you would come down the stair, and tonight you came down it. You did not need me to make you do it. You did it because you decided to. Marry me, Diana, not because I took you from a chapel, but because tonight you were the one who chose to stay." She did not answer him in words. She set her bare left hand, with the Egerton signet returned to its finger, on top of his right hand where it rested on the silver fox of the cane. She left it there. The cane and the 2 hands made one small column of warmth in the cold of the garden, and the half-moon found them, and from a window somewhere, a fragment of country dance drifted out and went on without them. After a long while she spoke. "There is a thing I have learned," she said, "from a gray dress, and a stolen cloak, and a wrong carriage, and a library of credit books, and a room of 200 people. Tell me." She looked at him. "It is not the gown," she said. "It is not the diamonds, it is not even the name, it is being seen. It is being truly seen by someone who has nothing to gain by looking. The rest of my life I will be very careful, sir, of who is permitted to look at me, and tonight I permit you." He did not answer her in words either. He only turned his hand under hers so that her palm lay in his palm, and closed his fingers around the small hand with the returned ring, and held it. Beyond the garden wall, in a square they could not see, Lord Egerton was being helped into a closed carriage by two men in plain coats, and taken east toward the Marshalsea. In a side street off Berkeley Square, Lord Mordaunt was walking in his shirt-sleeves toward a carriage that no longer answered to him, because the horses, like the mines, had been bought that afternoon. In the long gallery of Berkeley Square, the orchestra had moved from the country dance into a waltz, and Lady Honoria was telling a fourth Duchess that of course she had always intended Miss Egerton for Pelham, and the Duchess was already believing her. And in the garden of Pelham House, on a stone bench beneath a rose arbor out of season, a young woman in claret silk and the Pelham diamonds laid her bare hand on a duke's hand, on the silver head of a cane, and was, at last, no longer running. She had climbed into the wrong carriage to escape a scandal. She had been seen, instead, and that, in the end, was the only door she had ever needed to open. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been treated like a bank draft passed between men who never asked your name? Have you ever, like Diana, walked into a room in claret silk and diamonds you did not inherit, and discovered that the cost of being finally seen was learning to stand alone first? And when the ledger of every debt against you was opened in public, would you have placed your bare hand over his on the cane, or walked into the rose garden alone? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives only after a woman chooses herself, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel